The entire story of Númenor. Explained, LOTR lore. What if the greatest civilization ever given to men was never meant to survive? Not destroyed by accident, not undone by a single villain's cleverness, but built from its very foundation, in a shape that pointed toward its own ending, the way a door is built around the fact of its opening. Here is what the Akalabeth actually says when you follow it all the way down. Not the broad strokes, not the drowned island and the lost glory and the ancestor of Aragorn. The actual text. The granular, devastating, philosophically coherent text that Tolkien spent decades refining because he believed it was lodged inside him, recurring in a dream of a great wave rolling toward land, unstoppable, and he needed to know what it meant. This is not backstory. Númenor is not the thing that happened before the story. Númenor is the wound that makes the story necessary. Every grief in The Lord of the Rings, every diminishment, every tower built too high, and every king who reached for something he should not have reached for, it flows from one island, one prohibition, and one choice made by a civilization at the exact moment of its greatest power. And the question that the Akalabeth raises, quietly, between its lines, the question that Tolkien himself circles in his letters without ever fully answering, is this. If the beings who made Númenor could see what was coming, if they watched 25 kings walk the same road toward the same horizon, was Númenor a gift? Or was it a test designed to be failed? Do not answer that yet. Hold it. Because the answer changes depending on how deep you are willing to go, and we are going all the way down. The story begins not with a king, or a city, or a catastrophe. It begins with a promise made to men who had already lost almost everything. Picture this. The War of Wrath has ended. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, the Valar who turned against creation before the world was made, has been cast out through the door of night, into the void, beyond the edges of the universe. The war that ended him was so total, so violent, that Beleriand, the continent where most of the First Age's great events unfolded, has been swallowed by the sea. Entire kingdoms, entire histories, entire lineages of elves and men who fought for centuries against the darkness, gone beneath the water. What remains of the Edain, the men who were faithful, who allied themselves with the elves, who bled at Dagor Bragollach and the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and every other catastrophe the First Age could invent? What remains of them is essentially a remnant. Survivors on the shores of a changed world, looking at a horizon where a continent used to be. And the Valar, the angelic powers who govern the created world under Eru Ilúvatar, make them an offer. The Akalabeth records it precisely. Tolkien writes that the Valar took counsel, and the Edain were given a land to dwell in, neither part of Middle-earth nor of Valinor, for it was sundered from either by a wide sea. An island, raised from the depths of the ocean, westernmost of mortal lands, called Elena, the Starwoods, because a star guided them there, and given a name that would become the most resonant word in all the Second Age, Númenor, the Westerness, the land of the star. Now pay attention to what comes with the gift, because this is where it gets strange. The Edain are given long life, not immortality, but extended life, so that the men of Númenor will live 3 times the span of ordinary men, some of the early kings living more than 400 years. They are given wisdom and craft, and a stature that makes them unlike any men who came before. The Valar grant them friendship and communication with the elves of the Blessed Realm. Ships from Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle just off the shores of Valinor, will come to them bearing gifts and lore. In every meaningful sense, the Edain are elevated above all other mortal peoples and placed in a location that is closer to the divine than any men have ever been allowed to come. And then the Valar attach one condition, one prohibition, one ban. The Númenorians are forbidden to sail west, past the point where Tol Eressëa can be seen on the horizon, into the undying lands themselves. They are forbidden to seek the blessed realm. The Valar are clear about why. The undying lands are not what make the elves immortal. Elven immortality is a property of their nature, not their geography. If men were to come to Valinor, they would not gain immortality. They would simply die there instead of in Middle-earth, and they would die weighted with the grief of having reached for something that was never theirs to take. Here is what that prohibition does, in practice, to a civilization. It puts the thing men most desire directly on the horizon they are forbidden to cross. Every morning, in the western port cities of Númenor, the sun rises behind you and sets in the direction you cannot sail. Every Númenorian who lives longer than ordinary men, who watches friends from Middle-earth age and die while they endure, who feels the accumulated weight of years that their ancestors never had to carry, every one of them wakes up and looks west and sees the prohibition. Tolkien says this explicitly in Letter 212. He writes that the band set their faces east, while everything they longed for was west. The geography of Númenor is not just geography. It is a daily instruction in the meaning of limitation. It is a gift that contains its own grief as a structural component. And from the very beginning, that grief was there. The first king of Númenor is Elros, son of Erendil, brother of Elrond. Here is something that does not get said enough. Elros and Elrond were given a choice by the Valar, because of their mixed heritage, their father being a man and their mother being an elf of sorts. They were permitted to choose which kindred they would belong to. Elrond chose the elves and immortality, and became the Lord of Rivendell who stands in the Third Age. Elros chose men and mortality, and became the first king of Númenor. Think about what that means. The man who founds Númenor made a deliberate, conscious, fully informed choice to be mortal. He knew what he was giving up. He knew his brother would live forever, while he would die. He chose anyway, and the Akallabeth tells us he died at the age of 500 years, having lived a life of extraordinary length and accomplishment, and he died willingly, as the Eldar reported that the early Númenorian kings did, when they felt the waning of their powers, would depart from life at their own will and in honor. That is not a civilization in crisis. That is a civilization at peace with its nature. The question is what changed, and the answer is not Sauron, not yet. The Akallabeth traces the shift with the kind of precision that rewards slow reading. In the early centuries, the Númenorians sail east to Middle-earth, as the Valar instructed them, and they go as healers and teachers. Tolkien writes that they brought gifts of food and of other matters, and that they tried to heal the hurts of the world. The men of Middle-earth, who have been living under the shadow of Morgoth's long dominion, receive them as something close to divine, and that reception, the worship of ordinary men looking up at these tall, long-lived, extraordinarily gifted visitors from the sea, that reception begins to do something to the Númenorians. Pride is not born in failure. Pride is born in genuine superiority that begins to mistake itself for right. The Númenorians were genuinely superior to the men of Middle-earth in almost every measurable way. They were taller, longer-lived, more skilled in craft and seamanship and war, and they were backed by the friendship of the elves and the blessing of the Valar. Their exceptionalism was not imagined, it was real. And that is what makes the corruption that follows so interesting, because it was not paranoia or delusion that turned Númenor toward empire. It was the logical extension of a real advantage meeting a real desire. Because here is what Tolkien actually records in the Akallabeth about what the later Númenorians do in Middle-earth. He writes that they hunted the men of Middle-earth and put them in bonds. That they built havens and great towns, but not for trade and friendship, for extraction. That they took timber and other goods, and that ordinary men were driven far away from the coasts. This is the Akallabeth speaking. This is Tolkien's text. Not the slave-trading colonizing empire of Amazon's rings of power, which has been criticized as an invention, but Tolkien's own account, which is actually more damning than what the show presents, because it shows the process by which a civilization of healers becomes a civilization of empire, not through a single decision, but through the slow accumulation of 1,000 small ones. And all of it is connected, in the Akalabeth's logic, to the ban. As the Númenorians' lifespans begin, generationally, to shorten, as the peace and wisdom of the early kings gives way to the ambition and restlessness of the middle ones, as they sail further east and find that their power over men of Middle-earth is essentially absolute, they begin to ask a question that the text renders with devastating simplicity. Why should we die? We are greater than other men. We are friends of the Valar. We are half-elvish by ancient kinship. Why is the gift of immortality withheld from us? It is not a foolish question. That is the point. It is entirely understandable. It is the question any thinking person would eventually ask in their position. And the Valar's answer, which is given through the Eldar who still come to Númenor in these middle centuries, is deeply unsatisfying to a civilization that has grown used to its own greatness. The answer is, essentially, because Eru willed it so, and the fate of men is Eru's gift, and not a punishment, and the end of men is not the same as the end of elves, and perhaps beyond the circles of the world, something waits that neither men nor elves yet understand. It is a true answer. It is a beautiful answer, in the framework of Tolkien's theology. It is an answer that requires faith in a creator whose designs exceed mortal understanding. And it is an answer that a civilization at the height of its power, watching the western horizon every morning, simply cannot hold. The fracture does not arrive with Sauron. This is the thing nobody seems to fully grasp. The fracture arrives with Tar-Ankalimon, the 13th king of Númenor, who rules in the middle of the Second Age, roughly 1,700 years before Ar-Pharazôn, 1,700 years before the catastrophe. And what Unfinished Tales documents in the line of Elros is one of the most quietly devastating records in all of Tolkien's writing. Under Tar-Ankalimon, the Númenorians begin to divide, formally, institutionally, into two camps that Tolkien names with uncomfortable clarity. The King's Men, who are the majority, who resist Elvish influence, and the Valar's authority, and who increasingly frame the ban not as wisdom, but as oppression. And the Faithful, who are the minority, who maintain friendship with the Eldar and allegiance to the Valar, and who preserve the old language of Quenya when it becomes politically unfashionable to speak it. The King's Men do not start out as villains. That matters. They begin as a political faction that expresses what most people would feel in their position: resentment at a prohibition that seems arbitrary, ambition for a civilization that is unquestionably mighty, grief at a mortality that feels disproportionate. The Faithful are not simply the brave heroes of the story either. They are the people who have accepted the harder truth, that greatness does not entitle you to everything, that limitation is not the same as punishment, that the question, "Why should I die?" does not always have an answer that satisfies. Under Tar-Ankalimon, Quenya, the Elvish high tongue, becomes politically charged. The King's Men stop speaking it in public. They start removing Elvish names and replacing them with Adunaic, the native tongue of men. This sounds like cultural politics. It is actually a symptom of something theological, because Quenya is not just a language. It is the language of the Eldar, who maintain it as a link to Valinor, to the undying lands, to the tradition that connects Númenor to the divine. Banning Quenya is not language reform. It is a rejection of the framework within which the ban makes sense. You cannot tell people they are forbidden to seek immortality and also teach them to revere the beings who gave them that prohibition. The King's Men understand this. They are not confused. They are choosing. Picture this. Tar-Ankalimon stands in his throne room in Ar-Menelaos, the golden city of Númenor, and before him are two delegations. On his left, the lords of the King's Men, representing the great majority of Númenorian nobility, who have come to ask him to restrict the building of the Elvish-style temples that the Faithful maintain in the west of the island. On his right, a small group of the faithful, including probably some representative of whatever family at that time preserves the old loyalties, holding their position with the quiet certainty of people who know they are losing the argument. Tar Ancalimon does not ban the faithful. He does not persecute them. He is not yet that king. He is merely the king under whom the split becomes official, under whom the two factions acquire their names and their territories and their distinct cultural identities. He looks at his island and sees it divided, and he chooses the majority, because that is what kings do, and because he agrees with them, and because the logic of the king's men is so much easier to carry than the logic of the faithful. And from that throne room, a decision radiates forward 1700 years, through 12 more kings, through the slow grinding of a civilization against its own prohibition, to the moment when a man named Gimilcard has a son named Pharazôn, Ar-Pharazôn, the Golden, the last king of Númenor. By the time Ar-Pharazôn seizes the throne, he has to seize it, because the legitimate heir is a woman named Tar Miriel, who is simply queen, and Ar-Pharazôn takes her by force, marrying her against her will in violation of Númenorian law, and the Akallabeth records that she wept. That detail is not ornamental. It is the text telling you what the seizure of power looks like at its most personal level. Tar Miriel, who is described in unfinished tales as perhaps the most gifted of all Númenorian rulers, who might have been a great queen, who loved the old ways and was of the faithful in her heart, is consumed by Ar-Pharazôn's ambition before she ever gets the chance to rule. Ar-Pharazôn is the most powerful man alive. The Akallabeth is explicit about this. He assembles the greatest fleet Númenor has ever launched and sails to Middle-earth, not to trade, not to heal, not even to colonize. He sails to confront Sauron, who has been building his power in Mordor and styling himself Lord of the Earth, and who has been raiding Númenorian territories with sufficient aggression to provide a pretext. And here is where the story shifts into something that should make your skin crawl. Because Ar-Pharazôn arrives on the shores of Middle-earth with that enormous fleet, and Sauron's forces simply melt away. The Akallabeth says this. It says that when the Númenorian host assembled, the servants of Sauron fled or hid themselves, and Sauron's own people deserted him. No battle, no siege. The sight of the Númenorian army is sufficient to collapse Sauron's military position entirely. And Ar-Pharazôn, standing at the head of the greatest mortal force in the history of the world, demands that Sauron come before him and swear fealty. And Sauron does. Not under duress, not after a siege, not as a defeated general carried in chains. He walks to the Númenorian camp, and he kneels, and he submits. The Akallabeth says that Sauron humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn and smoothed his tongue. And then it says something that Tolkien knew would be the most chilling sentence in the chapter. Sauron asks to be taken to Númenor. He asks. This is not a prisoner requesting clemency. This is not a defeated enemy, hoping for lenient treatment. Sauron, who in Tolkien's cosmology is a Maya, a being of angelic power and ancient cunning, who served Morgoth and survived his defeat and rebuilt his power across centuries, calculates in a single moment that he cannot defeat the Númenorian fleet by force, and so he decides to be taken. He sees the island. He sees the civilization. He sees the fracture that 1700 years of resentment have built into its foundation, and he decides that the most effective weapon against the greatest mortal power in the world is to let himself be captured. Think about the patience that requires. Think about what it means to be willing to submit, to kneel, to be carried as a trophy aboard an enemy fleet, to spend however many years it takes earning trust in a civilization that despises you, because you can see clearly that once you are inside, the work will not be difficult. Sauron does not need to corrupt Númenor. Númenor is already corrupted. He needs to accelerate it. He needs to find the fracture and press. And he has all the time in the world. Picture this. The fleet returns to Ar-Menelaos in triumph. Ar-Pharazôn has done what no mortal king before him ever managed. He has made the Dark Lord kneel. The cities celebrate. The king's men celebrate most loudly, because this is exactly what they have always argued, that Númenor's power is its own justification, that they need no divine permission, that they are great enough to bring even a Maya to his knees. Sauron arrives in Númenor as a prisoner and is housed appropriately, guarded appropriately, watched appropriately. Except that Ar-Pharazôn is a man who values brilliance and eloquence, and Sauron is, among other things, one of the most eloquent beings ever to exist. He was Mairon before the corruption, a Maya of Aule the Smith, whose original excellence was in craft and order and the precise management of complex systems. He knows how power works from the inside. He knows how to identify what a man wants and offer it in terms the man has never heard before, but instantly recognizes as the shape of his desire. Within 3 years, the Akallabeth tells us, Sauron has become Ar-Pharazôn's chief counselor. Within a few more, he has his own seat in the king's inner council. Within a generation, he has introduced a new theological framework to Númenor, a cult of Morgoth, whom he names Eru's equal or superior, the Lord of the world, whom the Númenorians can worship in exchange for the power they have been denied. And at the center of this cult, on the hill of Meneltarma, where the Númenorians had always maintained a sacred space, open to the sky with no roof and no idol, no image of anything divine, just the openness of the sky, and the presence of Eru felt in silence, Sauron has a great temple built. The Akallabeth describes the temple at Armenelos, and the description is architectural horror, round, enormous, 500 feet across, with walls so thick that the crown of the dome reaches 500 feet into the air, built to shadow the Meneltarma, built to replace the open reverence of the Númenorian tradition with enclosure, with spectacle, with something you can point at and say, "There is your God." And in its fires, Sauron begins burning the trees of Nimloth. This requires a moment. Nimloth the Fair is the white tree of Númenor, which was a seedling of Celeborn of Tol Eressëa, which was itself a seedling of Galathilion in Tirion, which was made by Yavanna in the image of Telperion, one of the 2 trees of Valinor, whose light was the original light of the world, before the sun and moon were made. The lineage of the white tree goes from Númenor's garden back to the literal beginning of time. It is not a religious symbol in the way a cross or a statue is a symbol. It is a living connection, a biological link between the world Númenor inhabits and the world from which all light originally came. Sauron tells Ar-Pharazôn that Nimloth must be cut down and burned in the temple's fires, because it is the emblem of elvish friendship and the Valar's claim over Númenor, and if Númenor is to be free, it must reject that claim in every form. Isildur, who will later take the One Ring from Sauron's hand, and who is at this point a young man of the faithful, steals a fruit from Nimloth before the tree is cut down. The Akallabeth says he crept through the guards in the darkness and was wounded escaping and nearly died. But he preserved the fruit, and from that fruit the lineage of the White Tree continues, through Gondor, through the sapling that Gandalf finds on the mountainside in The Return of the King, through every white tree that ever stood in Minas Tirith. Let that connect. The tree in Minas Tirith is not a symbol of Númenorian civilization. It is the last living link to the light of the 2 trees of Valinor. It exists because one young man of the faithful bled in the dark to steal a piece of fruit before Sauron had everything burned. The faithful, by this point, are in real danger. The Akallabeth describes the persecution systematically. The king's men, emboldened by Sauron and the cult of Morgoth, begin bringing accusations against the faithful. They are arrested and charged as spies or traitors. Some are burned in the temple fires, which Sauron says Morgoth will accept as living sacrifice. Amandil, the Lord of the Faithful, who was once a friend of Ar-Pharazôn and who was removed from the king's council when Sauron arrived, watches his civilization from a distance and understands clearly that what is coming cannot be stopped by human means. He does something extraordinary, and it barely gets discussed. Amundil decides to sail west. Secretly, telling only his son Elendil, he sails in the direction of Valinor, intending to repeat what Arundel did at the end of the First Age, to reach the Blessed Realm and beg the Valar to intervene before Ar-Pharazôn's madness destroys everything. Unfinished Tales is clear on this detail. Amundil does not expect to survive the journey. He knows the ban still stands. He sails anyway. We do not know what happens to him. He sails west, and the record ends. No arrival, no message returned, nothing. He disappears into the ocean and is never heard from again. And yet, Elendil and his sons escape Númenor with the 9 ships of the faithful, and they carry the Palantiri and the fruit of Nimloth and fragments of the lore of Númenor, and they survive. Whether Amundil's sacrifice was heard, whether something in his sailing moved something in the Valar's council, the Akallabeth does not say. It only says that Elendil was warned in a dream and fled, and that the warning came. The connection is left as an opening, an unanswered question in the text itself. And so we come to Ar-Pharazôn's last decision. Sauron tells the king, in the Akallabeth's account, that the Undying Lands are not undying by nature but by possession, that the Valar have hoarded immortality for themselves, and that any who set foot on the shores of Aman and claimed it would have eternal life. This is a lie. Tolkien's cosmology is clear. The Undying Lands do not grant immortality. But Ar-Pharazôn does not know that, and Sauron has spent years ensuring that the king's theological education is entirely filtered through Sauron's framework. Ar-Pharazôn is old by this point. He has reigned for 64 years. He is well past the span of most men, even Númenorian men. He is watching himself age and he is terrified. And Sauron, who can see this clearly, tells him that the answer is west. Take the fleet. Take the army. Claim what is yours. You are the mightiest king in the world. The Valar have no right to keep immortality from you. Ar-Pharazôn raises the greatest armada the world has ever seen. Ships without number. The sky darkens with them when they launch. The Akallabeth says they were so many that the seas were crowded with them and the waves were beaten into foam by the passage of so many keels. This is not an exaggeration for effect. Tolkien is building to a specific irony, and the armada's size is part of its meaning, because a force this size is not a military strategy. It is a statement. Ar-Pharazôn is not sending an army to win. He is sending everything because he needs everything to be there when he claims his victory. The scale is the point. They sail, past the horizon, past the point where the ban had always turned Númenorian ships back, into the Forbidden West. And here is the part that almost no retelling stops to sit with. They get there. The Akallabeth is unambiguous. Ar-Pharazôn's fleet reaches Aman. They see the shores of the Undying Lands. The Eldar flee before them. The ships land. Ar-Pharazôn steps onto the shores of Aman and raises his banner and claims the realm for himself and declares the rule of the Númenorians over the Blessed Land. He wins. In every military and logistical sense, he wins. No force on the physical plane stops him. The Valar, seeing what has come, lay down their stewardship of Arda and appeal to Eru Ilúvatar directly. And Tolkien writes, in one of the most extraordinary passages in the Silmarillion, that Eru showed forth his power. The sea swallows the armada, the earth opens and swallows it further. Ar-Pharazôn and his host are buried under falling hills, and will remain imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten until the last battle, not dead, imprisoned, a detail that echoes forward into the mythology in ways that are still not fully explored. And Númenor itself is drowned. The Akallabeth describes Tar Miriel, the true queen who had been imprisoned by Ar-Pharazôn's ambition, trying to climb the slopes of Meneltarma, the sacred mountain, the highest point of the island, trying to outrun the wave. She does not make it. The text says the wave took her. She dies at the summit she almost reached. That image is not casual. Tar Miriel, reaching for the highest point of the holy mountain, as the wave takes her, is Tolkien giving you in miniature the entire story of Númenor. The faithful, reaching as high as they can, the wave taking them anyway. But this is where the cosmological scale of what Eru does next has to be understood in full, because most tellings treat the drowning of Númenor as the end of the event. It is not even close to the end. When Eru acts, he does not just sink an island, he remakes the world. Arda, before this moment, is flat. The Silmarillion and the Ainulindal and the entire cosmological architecture of Tolkien's world prior to this point describes a world with a physical edge, beyond which the void lies. Valinor exists on the physical plane, in the west. It is real estate, in the most literal sense, a place you could sail to if the ban were lifted. After Eru's intervention, the world is made round, the physical plane is restructured, Valinor is removed from the geography of the world entirely, placed outside the circles of the world, accessible only by the straight road, which the elves are still permitted to sail, but which mortal ships cannot hold. Men who sail west now find only open ocean curving around a sphere, because the Blessed Realm no longer exists in the same dimensional register as the physical world. This is a permanent, irreversible alteration of the universe, performed in response to one king's decision to sail too far. Think about the proportion of that. One man's pride reshaped the geometry of creation. One armada, one moment of supreme arrogance at its apex of apparent success, caused Eru Ilúvatar to restructure the ontology of the world. The wave that swallows Númenor is not just a natural disaster scaled up. It is the moment the relationship between the physical and the divine is permanently and fundamentally changed. And this is where we have to return to the central question, but with everything we now know pressing on it from behind. Because here is what the question actually contains at this depth. The Valar knew. They are beings of vast foreknowledge, servants of an omniscient creator, who have watched men since the beginning. They knew, when they raised Elena from the sea and set the Edain upon it with their gift of long life, that long life would produce this longing. They had watched Morgoth for ages and knew how resentment and pride could consume greatness. They had watched the elves in Valinor face similar tests and, not always successfully, navigate them. They watched Feanor, the greatest of the Noldor, whose pride destroyed an entire people. They watched Melkor himself, who was the greatest of the Ainur, fall to precisely this, the refusal to accept that his greatness did not entitle him to dominion. And knowing all of that, they gave men a kingdom within sight of immortality, with one prohibition that guaranteed that immortality would be what every Númenorian looked toward every morning. You could argue, and Tolkien's own letters suggest he was aware of this argument, that the gift was still genuinely good, that the Edain deserved it, that the generations who received it well and lived wisely within it were exactly what the gift was designed to produce, that it is not the Valar's fault that the civilization chose the path it chose. Tolkien, in Letter 131, is fairly clear that he does not see the destruction as simple punishment for what amounts to original sin. He sees it as the consequence of a specific choice made by specific people. But the speculative bridge that the Akallabeth builds, without quite crossing, is whether the specific shape of the gift guaranteed the specific shape of the failure, not determined it. That would violate Tolkien's insistence on free will as a fundamental cosmological principle, but guaranteed it in the sense of making it the most probable outcome, the outcome you would predict if you were watching from a sufficient height, the outcome that a being of great foresight who understood men's nature would have seen as the likely end of the experiment. And if that is true, then what does the wave mean? There is a reading of the wave that is comforting in its moral simplicity. Ar-Pharazôn chose wrong, and he paid, and the faithful survived, and the world went on. This is the reading that most tellings land on. And it is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, because of Tar Miriel. Tar Miriel was of the faithful. She was not a worshipper of Morgoth. She was not a supporter of the war on Valinor. She was a prisoner of Ar-Pharazôn's ambition, forced into marriage against her will, stripped of her legitimate authority, and then drowned on the slopes of the sacred mountain she was running toward when the wave caught her. The wave does not distinguish. The Akallabeth is explicit about the scale of the destruction. Númenor is drowned entirely. The entire island, its peoples, its cities, the king's men and the servants of the cult, but also the ordinary people, who were neither zealots nor saints, the merchants and farmers and sailors, who had nothing to do with the great decisions of kings, all of them. Tolkien does not flinch from this, and he does not try to retroactively justify it by making everyone on the island complicit. He lets the wave be what it is, an act of divine power at a cosmic scale, performed in response to a cosmic transgression that does not and cannot and perhaps was not designed to be proportionate at the individual level. This is the hardest thing the Akallabeth asks you to hold. Not the hubris of Ar-Pharazôn, which is straightforward, not the cleverness of Sauron, which is sinister but comprehensible, but the nature of the wave itself. What it means that Eru acts here, directly, personally, for only the third time in all of the Legendarium's recorded history. The first being the making of the world, the second being the creation of men and elves in the first place, and the third being the destruction of Númenor. This is the tier of event Tolkien places Númenor's fall in. It belongs with creation. It is not a historical tragedy. It is a cosmological reconfiguration. And Sauron, who caused it, escapes. His body is destroyed. The Akallabeth is clear about this. Sauron is on Númenor when it falls, and his physical form is annihilated in the catastrophe. But his spirit, his corrupted Maya nature, survives and flees back to Middle-earth. And here is a detail that demands to be named directly. Tolkien writes in Unfinished Tales that after the destruction of Númenor, Sauron could never again appear fair to the eyes of men. He loses the ability to take a pleasing form. He is locked into what he has become, darkness made visible. His punishment for Númenor is vanity. He will never again be beautiful. He will never again be able to walk among his enemies as a trusted counselor. He will never again have the tool that was his most effective weapon. The seduction of Númenor, the long game of a prisoner who wanted to be taken, the masterwork of his corruption, costs him the thing that made it possible. And yet the damage is done. Númenor is gone. The world is round. The faithful have escaped on 9 ships, with the remnants of what was preserved, Isildur's seedling of the White Tree, the 7 stones of seeing, the sword of Elendil, and the lineage of a civilization that was the greatest mankind ever produced. They land in Middle-earth. They build Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south, the twin kingdoms of the Númenorian exiles. And Gondor, in particular, carries within it from its very first moment the specific grief of what it lost. Picture this: Elendil and Isildur and Anarion, standing on the shores of Middle-earth with their 9 ships and their survivors, looking east at a continent they must now govern, and west at an ocean that contains, somewhere in its depths, everything they were. They carry the Númenorian genius with them, their architecture, their seamanship, their military sophistication, their astronomical knowledge, their libraries. But they cannot carry the thing that made Númenor what it was, which was not power or craft, but the specific grace of a civilization in its early centuries that had accepted its own limitation and been luminous within it. What they carry instead is the wound. The Akallabeth calls the tradition of the Númenorian exiles the shadow of Númenor, and the letters confirm that this shadow is not metaphorical. It is the actual unresolved grief of a people who watch their world drown, who know what they lost and know why, who carry the memory of both the greatness and the failure simultaneously, and who must now build something new with the material that remains. Gondor's entire arc across the Third Age makes sense as the continuation of this shadow, The obsession with bloodline, with the purity of Númenorian descent, is not simple aristocratic snobbery. It is a civilization desperately trying to preserve its connection to what it was before the wave. The decreasing lifespans of Gondor's kings, which Unfinished Tales documents precisely. The gradual shortening from the centuries of the early Númenorian descended rulers to the spans closer to ordinary men's lives. This is not biological drift. Tolkien frames it as spiritual depletion, the shadow lengthening as the distance from the source increases. The stewards of Gondor arise because the royal line fails, and no one is of sufficient Númenorian purity to take the throne without contested claim. And Aragorn, who is the heir of Elendil, who carries the bloodline intact, because the northern Dúnedain preserved it through centuries of concealment and hardship. Aragorn is the restoration that the shadow of Númenor has been waiting for across the entire Third Age. But notice what it takes to produce that restoration. Aragorn is not simply born. He is the product of millennia of precise preservation, of a lineage maintained through deliberate effort and enormous sacrifice, of the faithful's tradition continuing underground across 3,000 years in the north, because the kingdoms of the exiles eventually failed or were diminished. He is what survives of Númenor after everything else is stripped away. And what survives is not the power or the city or the fleet. It is the man. That is the answer the Lord of the Rings gives to the question the Akallabeth asks. After the flood, after the cosmological reconfiguration, after the loss of everything that made Númenor extraordinary, what remains? A man, walking in the wild under a false name, carrying a broken sword, and a lineage most people have forgotten. The shadow of Númenor is real. But so is what the shadow eventually produces. And now here is where we need to pull back far enough to see the full structure of what Tolkien built, because the connections between Númenor's fall and the events of The Lord of the Rings are not just thematic, they are mechanical, they are cause and effect. Sauron returns to Middle-earth after Númenor's fall and, having lost his fair form, retreats to Mordor and begins the long process of rebuilding. He still has the One Ring, he still has his Nazgûl, the 9 mortal kings who accepted the Rings of Power and who became wraiths, whose transformation the Ring's mechanics would have completed before the War of the Last Alliance. He still has everything except his ability to deceive openly. The War of the Last Alliance, Elendil and Isildur, and Gil-galad marching on Mordor and besieging Barad-dûr for 7 years, is Númenor's final direct consequence in the Second Age. It is the faithful's revenge and the faithful's purpose. The exiles, using what they preserved from the wreck of their civilization to prosecute a war against the being who engineered that civilization's destruction. And they succeed. They overthrow Sauron. They break his physical power, and then Isildur, standing over the defeated Sauron with the shard of Elendil's broken sword, cuts the ring from Sauron's finger, and does not destroy it. The ring goes into the river Anduin eventually, and is lost for 2,500 years, and is found by a hobbit named Smeagol who kills his cousin for it, and eventually reaches the Shire, and a comfortable hobbit named Bilbo and his nephew Frodo, and the entire War of the Ring follows directly from Isildur's inability, or refusal, to do in that moment what needed to be done. Why does Isildur refuse? The Lord of the Rings appendices record his own words. He says, "It is precious to me, though I buy it with great pain." Precious, the same word, the same pull. The ring does to Isildur in an instant what Sauron's long game did to Númenor across centuries. It identifies the fracture, the desire that was always there, the longing for something that cannot and should not be held, and it presses. Isildur is the son of Elendil. He bled for the White Tree. He escaped the wave. He fought 7 years for the right to stand where he is standing. He is, in every possible sense, a man of the faithful, and the ring still finds him. Because the faithful were not immune to the thing that destroyed Númenor. They were just the ones who held longest against it. And in the Third Age, with the ring in play, holding longest is not enough. The weight of all of this, the full architecture, from the raising of Elena to the crowning of Aragorn, is what makes The Lord of the Rings legible at its deepest level. Frodo's quest is not just the story of a small person doing something large. It is the resolution, 3,000 years in the making, of the specific wound inflicted when Ar-Pharazôn sailed west and Eru remade the world. The ring must be destroyed because it is the last surviving instrument of the catastrophe that began in Númenor. While it exists, Sauron can return. While Sauron can return, the wave is not finished. While the wave is not finished, the world is still in the shape that Númenor's fall created. Mount Doom, in this reading, is the final act of the Akallabeth. The fire that Frodo carries the ring to is the last echoing consequence of the fire in Sauron's temple on Meneltarma, where the trees of Nimloth burned. But here is the part that haunts me most about all of this. Think about who makes the choice at Mount Doom. Not Frodo. Not in the final moment. Frodo, standing at the crack of doom, after everything he has endured, after carrying the ring across half of Middle-earth, after the long, grinding destruction of everything that made him himself, claims the ring. He chooses it. He puts it on. Gollum takes it from him, accidentally, in a frenzy of his own obsession, and falls. The free will of the faithful, in the crucial final moment, is not sufficient. Frodo is not stronger than the ring. In the end, no mortal is stronger than the ring. The resolution of the story, the destruction of Sauron's power, and the healing of the wound that Númenor's fall opened, is achieved not by a great act of willpower, but by the accidental collision of Gollum's obsession with the geography of a volcano. Tolkien is making an argument here that his letters confirm. He writes in Letter 246 that Frodo should not be blamed for his failure at the crack of doom. He says that no mortal could have completed that task under the full weight of the ring so close to its source of power. And then he makes a theological point that is entirely consistent with the Akallabeth's framework. He says that Gollum's role was not accident, but providence. That a higher power was working through the event, that the mercy Bilbo and Frodo had shown to Gollum over the decades was being rewarded in the moment it was needed most. Eru, acting, again, not as dramatically as the flood, not with the full visible weight of a divine intervention that reshapes the world's geometry, but present, moving, working through the consequences of small mercies extended to a wretched creature across 30 years of story. If the destruction of Númenor is Eru's most visible intervention, the destruction of the ring is his most quiet one. And the contrast between those two moments is where Tolkien's entire mythology about the relationship between providence and free will lives. The flood is power. The crack of doom is grace. Picture this. Frodo Baggins, on the edge of the fire, with the ring on his finger, invisible, consumed. And somewhere in the texture of that moment, at a level that no character in the story can perceive, something that has been patient for 3,000 years, that watched the wave, and watched the building of Gondor, and watched the long diminishment of the Númenorian exiles, and watched the ring pass from Isildur to the river, to Sméagol, to Bilbo, to Frodo, something that was also present in the Akallabeth when a dreaming writer in Oxford kept seeing a wave, allows the story to go the only way it could have gone. Gollum falls, the ring falls, and the wave, which has been hanging over the world since Númenor drowned, finally breaks. Gondor does not immediately become Númenor again. That would be too simple, and Tolkien is never simple about this. What Aragorn's kingship begins is a healing, not a restoration. The shadow of Númenor cannot be simply reversed. The world is still round. The straight road is still closed to men. Valinor is still beyond the physical reach of mortal sailors. The cosmological change Eru performed when Ar-Pharazôn's fleet landed on Aman's shores is permanent. It cannot be undone, not even by the destruction of the ring, not even by the end of Sauron. What can happen, what does happen, is that the specific instrument of the specific wound is removed. The ring is gone. Sauron, without his ring and without his physical body, and now stripped of the essential animating spirit that he poured into that ring across the ages of the world, simply dissipates. He does not die in any meaningful sense. He loses coherence. He becomes, as Tolkien describes it in Letter 338, a mere spirit of malice that gnaws itself in the shadows, but cannot again grow or take shape. Not a victory over death, not a return of the undying lands, not a healing of the fundamental wound that mortality is a gift men cannot always accept gracefully. Just the removal of the thing that had been pressing on that wound from outside for 3,000 years. And then the elves leave. The ring-bearers sail. And men are alone with Middle-earth in the way they were always going to be eventually. Without the presence of the divine so close and so visible, without the long memory of the Eldar, without the rings of power, without anything that was the legacy of the great ages except the stories. And the stories. That matters. Tolkien's entire project, not just the Lord of the Rings but the whole legendarium, from the music of the Ainur, to the fall of Númenor, to the destruction of the ring, is an argument that the stories are the continuity, that what a civilization was can survive in what a civilization told about itself, even when the civilization is under 3,000 fathoms of ocean. The Akallabeth survives, not as a physical document carried from the wreck, but in the tradition that Elendil brought with him, preserved through Gondor, recorded ultimately in the Red Book traditions that feed into the account we are reading. Tolkien's conceit, maintained carefully, is that these stories reached our world through some process he does not fully specify but gestures at in the letters, that the Atlantis dream he kept having was a kind of cultural memory, that the legend of Númenor is not invented but recovered, that somewhere in the human story of civilizations rising and falling and waves taking them down, the actual event is lodged. That is a claim that is impossible to evaluate as history and unnecessary to evaluate as mythology. What it does, as a poetic and philosophical position, is make the stakes of the Akallabeth larger than fantasy. It says, this is not a made-up story about made-up people who made made-up choices. This is the human story. This is what happens to us. This is what we do with gifts. This is the shape of our longing for the thing we cannot have. This is the wave we keep dreaming about. And this is where the emotional crescendo of the Akallabeth arrives, if you have followed it all the way down. Númenor is the most human story Tolkien ever told. More human than the ring. More human than the corruption of Saruman, or the pride of Turin, or the grief of Luthien. Because it is about an entire civilization, not one person or one family, and the question it asks is not, what does this individual do when tempted, but what does a people do when they are given everything and it is not quite enough? And the answer Tolkien gives is not a comfortable one, and is not a simple one, and is not a morally tidy one. They reach for more, not because they are evil, because they are mortal, and the thing mortality does to conscious beings is make the horizon of death feel like an injustice. The Númenorians were not wrong to feel that injustice. They were wrong to believe that the feeling authorized the crossing. And the difference between those two things, between the feeling and the crossing, is the entire moral space the Akallabeth occupies. The faithful held that line. The faithful felt the same longing, walked the same shores, looked at the same western horizon every morning of their long lives. Amandil himself, sailing west with no hope of survival because the ban still stood, demonstrates that the longing was universal. The difference is that the faithful believed, somehow, against the evidence of their own lifespans and the prosperity of the king's men, that the limitation was not punishment, that the Creator's design for men was not less than the Creator's design for elves, but different, that the gift of men was not a lesser gift, but an incomplete picture, and that the wave beyond the horizon was not the end. Tolkien believed this. His letters are clear. He believed in the resurrection of men. He believed that the gift of men, which the elves in the Silmarillion call the gift of Ilúvatar and speak of with something approaching envy, is genuinely a gift, not a curse, dressed up with courteous language. He believed that the freedom from the circles of the world that elves do not have, the freedom to be done with ardor and to pass into something beyond the Valar's understanding, is not less than immortality, but more than it, in a way that requires faith to hold. And the Akallabeth is his attempt to embody what happens when that faith fails. Not as a morality tale, as a tragedy, the genuine article, not a story where bad people do bad things and are punished, but a story where people who were great, who were given genuine gifts, who lived genuinely luminous lives in their early centuries, find themselves unable to hold the one thing that the gift required them to hold, which is the acceptance of their own ending. The wave is not punishment. The wave is completion. It is the shape that the gift always had, visible from the beginning if you could stand far enough back to see the whole arc. Eru gives men Númenor the same way a parent gives a child the ability to walk, knowing that the child will eventually walk toward a door the parent would not choose. The giving is still love. The door is still real. And the wave, when it comes, is the consequence of the door and not the failure of the love. This is Tolkien's Theodicy, wrapped in an island and an ocean and a dreaming man in Oxford, and it is more sophisticated and more honest than most explicitly theological texts that attempt the same argument, because it does not resolve cleanly. Tar Miriel is still drowned at the summit she almost reached. Amandil is still gone without a recorded arrival. The faithful still lose their world, and the healing, when it eventually comes, is quiet and incomplete, and takes 3,000 years. That is not a comfortable ending. But it is a true one, in the way that the best mythology is true. It describes something real about the experience of being a finite creature in a world that exceeds your grasp, and it refuses to make that experience simpler than it is. So let us return, one final time, to the question we opened with. Was Númenor a gift, or was it a test designed to be failed? Here is what I think Tolkien would say, and what the Akallabeth ultimately argues if you read it slowly enough. The question contains a false distinction. A gift can be a test can be a gift. The wave is not proof that the gift was false, any more than a child breaking a toy proves the toy was given in bad faith. The gift was real. The joy of the early centuries was real. The wisdom of Elros was real. The beauty of Nimloth was real. The learning of the Númenorians, their seamanship and their medicine and their architecture, and their friendship with the Eldar in the good centuries, all of it was real, and was genuinely Eru's gift working as intended. And the test was also real, not designed to be failed, but designed to be meaningful. Because a gift that requires nothing of the recipient is not a gift. It is a comfort object. The ban was not a cruelty, but a condition of the gift's meaning. It said, "You are given greatness, but greatness does not exempt you from the fundamental reality of what you are. You are mortal. You are finite. You are not the authors of existence." And whether you can hold that truth, at the height of your power, when the western horizon is right there, and you have ships enough to cross it, and an army strong enough to make the crossing stick, whether you can hold the truth of your own limitation at that exact moment, is the question that makes the gift a test, and the test a gift. Most Númenorians could not hold it. Under sufficient pressure, applied by someone as skilled as Sauron at finding the exact fracture in a civilization's foundation, they could not hold it, and the wave came. But the faithful held it. Not all of them, not perfectly, not without grief, but enough. Enough for 9 ships to sail east with the seedling of the White Tree, enough for the lineage of Elros to reach Isildur and Anarion, enough for the story to continue into the Third Age, and find its resolution in a hobbit who almost failed, but was caught at the last moment by something that was not quite accident. Enough for you to be sitting here, listening to this, knowing the name Númenor, knowing the shape of the wave, knowing what was lost and what was saved, and what the loss cost, and what the saving required. That is the continuity. That is what survived the flood. And if Tolkien's deepest intuition is right, if the story of Númenor is lodged in us the way he believed it was, in the dream of the wave that he gave to Faramir in the pages of The Lord of the Rings, and that he himself dreamed across the years of his life, then maybe the question the Akallabeth asks is not academic at all. Maybe it is asking what we do with our own gifts, the ones that are real, and real enough to break us if we are not careful, the ones that come with a horizon we are not meant to cross, and with a longing that we will feel anyway, and with a wave that is always waiting if we forget what we are. Not the first Dark Lord, not the most powerful king in the world, just us, given something extraordinary and looking west and trying, every day, to hold the line between what is ours and what is not. Tolkien never answered the question of whether the Valar knew what the gift would cost. He left that open, deliberately, the way all the best myths leave their hardest questions open, because the openness is the invitation. If this story means something to you, if Númenor feels less like a piece of backstory and more like a wound that has been bleeding into everything you love about Middle-earth, I want to hear what you found when you followed it all the way down. The conversation in the comments below carries everything this script cannot hold in a single sitting. What does Tar Miriel mean to you? What does Amandil's unreported arrival mean to you? What does the wave in Faramir's dream mean, recurring across an age, dreamed by a Tolkien who could not stop dreaming it? This channel is built for the people who cannot leave these questions alone. If that is you, stay with us. There is more to find, and the deeper you go, the more the locked doors open.